Great. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this session on the application of behavioral science in the context of the UN. My name is Mary McLennan. I lead what's called the UN Behavioural Science Group. It's an initiative of the UN Innovation Network that brings together more than 600 UN colleagues from across the system from more than 40 UN entities in 60 countries. And we aim to promote the application of behavioral science. So I lead this group alongside my colleague, Johanna Hakim, who's joined us today, and she runs the Innovation Network more broadly. So if you're interested in joining the group, we have colleagues from across the system, from brand new to behavioral science through to technical trained behavioral scientists as well. So please join. If you are outside the UN system and you want to engage in the work of the UN Behavioral Science Group, feel free to join as well in an observer role. Okay, so that's a bit about the context here in terms of UN Behavioral Science Week. So this is an event that will take place, this is taking place during UN Behavioral Science Week. There are over 15 sessions hosted by 9 UN entities, shown on the bottom of the slide. Topics range from COVID-19 vaccination through to peace and security, as well as nutrition. So lots there to explore. Here's the agenda if you haven't seen it just yet. Perhaps Johanna can share it in the chat, share it in the chat with you, so you can take a closer look if you haven't done so already. Just a few sessions to highlight here upcoming in the next few days. So there's a session with Professor Cass Sunstein taking place on Friday. We'll have an interactive discussion with him about sludge and perhaps ways of applying behavioral science to administration and management areas of the UN. We also have a session on Thursday looking at lessons learned applying behavioral science. So we have colleagues from government in Canada as well as the World Bank to share thinking with respect to more systematically applying behavioral science in organizations and some of the lessons learned. And then lastly, on tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern, we have an interactive discussion with Professor Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in behavioral economics. So he'll be speaking to a bit of his research, as well as how we can apply behavioral science to progress the SDGs more broadly. So if you have any questions, feel free to let us know. It should be pretty straightforward, though, from the agenda. So in terms of today's webinar, there will be two kind of key sections. So the first will be an introduction to behavioral science for those of you who are perhaps new to the field, looking to understand a bit more of the concepts and ideas in this space. And the second will really be to launch the UN Behavioral Science Report, which features experiences applying behavioral science from more than 25 UN entities. So lots to discuss there. So we're fortunate to have with us 3 colleagues from the UN who will share some of their case studies and under the hood application of behavioral science from their view. So we ask that in today's webinar, you put your questions into the Q&A box in the bottom of your screen, and also check it periodically, because you'd also have the option to upvote questions of your colleagues as we go ahead. So before we get started, I just wanted to ask a quick poll. Johanna, could you launch the poll, please? With respect to behavioral science experience. So how much do you know about behavioral science? Have you run a lot of projects, a fair amount, I've been following for some time, a little bit, but eager to learn more, or not much yet, sort of just a bit new to the field? Another question here is, which of the following behavioral,
sorry. There seems to be an issue with Zoom polling.
Okay.
It wasn't working for some reason, so we may have to skip it. And also, okay. I don't want to give away the second question, which is related to our presentation.
Yeah, I see that now. Okay, cool. So let's just move on then. Okay, so then on right to the first section of the webinar. We'll be hearing from 2 colleagues from MBED and the World Bank. If you haven't heard of MBED, they're a behavioral science team, and they've been around for a number of years. I encourage you to check out their website. There are lots of projects outlined there if you're interested in learning more behavioral science in a variety of different domains. So we'll hear today from Zeina Afif, who's a senior social scientist, as well as Yemena Ilkis, who's a behavioral scientist, and they'll cover a bit of an introduction to behavioral science for those who are new. So with that, over to Zeina and Yemena.
Thanks so much, Mary. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. We're going to start off with a quick small activity. If you don't mind getting a piece of paper and a pen next to you, or you could use your computer for that. And next slide, Jimena. Yes. So choose a number between 1 and 9, and multiply it by 9. Now, if the result has 2 digits, add them together and subtract 5 from the result. Now find the letter in the alphabet corresponding to the result. Once you've done that, think of the name of a country starting with that letter. And write down that name of the country. Okay, now choose the next letter in the alphabet. And think of the name of an animal starting with that letter. Let's pause here for a second. If you guys don't mind, please in the chat, add the name of the country and the name of the animal. Denmark elephant, Denmark eagle, Denmark emu, Denmark elephant. Okay, so we're seeing a lot of Denmark and elephant, some variation with the Dominican Republic and emu. Wow, Cuba and deer. All right, so next slide, Jimena. So as we kind of guessed, most of you will guess Denmark and elephant. We do see variation of this when people guess some other countries. What is happening? Why is that the case? Let's learn a little bit more about behavioral science. So we're going to give you, Jimena and I are going to give you a short introduction to behavioral science. We hope we do justice for the field. But just to get started, first, I want to give you a little background about us. We are the Mind Behavioral Development Embed team at the World Bank. We have over 30 staff consultants, partners working with us full-time, part-time on this work. And we pretty much work in every single policy area. So we work in education, we work in taxation, pretty much all of the fields. And the way we work is we conduct behavioral diagnostics. So we support World Bank projects by doing these behavioral diagnostics. We work in behavioral data such as psychometrics and others. We also really focus on evidence-based behavioral solutions. So we not only think of solutions based on what we know from the evidence, but we also try to conduct Rcts to see the evidence of the solutions themselves. We also do a lot of institutional capacity building and learning, and we produce a number of public goods and toolkits that you can find on our website, as well as we are part of a global network. So the way we do this, we really try to focus on a new area. We innovate, we pilot frontier work. Now the frontier could be because it's the first time we do it in development or at the World Bank. It doesn't mean that it's something completely original, but we try to innovate within the bank. We then move to advance, replicate the successful pilot and develop scalable adaptation. And then finally, we work on scale. And this is where we move towards an advisory role and knowledge sharing to allow other teams at the bank and outside to scale these solutions. And the way we work is in an iterative manner. So we start off by kind of defining, diagnosing the behavioral problem. We move towards designing solutions. We do implementation, evaluation, we adapt, but then we believe in that loop to going back and redefining, rediagnosing and adjusting interventions as we learn more and as implementation moves forward and context as well develops. So how do we make decisions? We're going to talk a little bit about this. A lot of the assumption is that when we want to make a decision, we want X, we take an action A, we get the result Y. If we don't want X, we take an action B, and we get a result no. But the reality is this is not kind of how we make most of our decisions. We are influenced by what we feel we deserve, what we feel people expect from us, what mood I'm in, is it easy, can I put it off? So there's many things that affect the way we basically make decisions. And at the World Bank, we developed this framework through the World Development in the World Development Report 2015, where we basically came up with 3 key ways we make decisions. We think automatically, so we rely a lot on mental shortcuts, and we saw that when we did the first exercise. A lot of people thought of Denmark and elephant. They're the most common D and E countries and animals you would think about. But we also think socially. So we pretty much cooperate as long as others are doing the same. We rely a lot on our social networks and norms. We do pretty much most of the time what people around us are doing. We also think with mental models. So we're not like inventing new concepts of new way of seeing the world or thinking. This is very much influenced by our history, by our society, and by what we've learned through our lives. And why is this important? So a lot of the policies, when they are developed, you know, the standard economics basically design policies that people are deliberate. They're going to carefully avoid systematic errors. They're going to take all information, that they're going to be selfish. They're going to do what's best for them, regardless of what anybody else does, and that they are objective. They see the world as it is. And because of that, a lot of the standard policy tools are information, you know, providing communication campaigns and information, providing incentives and prices, or changing laws. But that's not enough. We, as you can tell, we think automatically, we think socially with mental models. So we also need to think behaviorally, and we need to think of behavioral tools as well. And this is where things such as default, which you will hear a little bit more about, framing and using social identity and norms can really complement nicely a lot of the policy tools to basically lead to the behavior change that you're trying to achieve through these programs. So where behavioral science can help, it could be as simple as, you know, simplifying procedures, improving choice architecture, adjusting the information provided, sending reminders, but it can also be to using social networks, norms, and providing new mental models. What does that mean? We're going to hear a little bit more about this, and we're going to hear a little bit more from Jimena, who's going to talk to us about some of the key concepts in behavioral science.
Great, thank you, Seina. Sorry, let me pass. Okay, fantastic. So I'll briefly explain a few concepts from behavioral science. As Seina was saying, I'll introduce also one of the most famous frameworks that we use for designing solutions. And finally, I'll show you one application of how we designed a solution in practice. Okay, so let me get started with this graph. This graph is showing organ donation rates by country. And as you can see, countries on the left have very low rates of organ donation, while countries on the right have extremely high rates of organ donation. Now, I want to ask you, and if you could please respond in the chat with one or a few words, what do you think is the main difference between, let's say, Germans and Austrians regarding donation rates? And please reply in the chat. Okay, I see a couple of answers. Okay, so very interesting. So I'm seeing that most of you know the answer, right? And this is great. Basically, what this graph is really showing is the power of defaults, right? The answer lays in the design of the policy. Well, in Germany, you have to opt in to become an organ donor, and in Austria, by default, you are an organ donor, meaning that if you want to opt out, you would have to place some effort into it. And what is interesting here is that theory would say that there shouldn't be any difference if the policy is to opt out or to opt in, and more in a subject as important as organ donation. But we see that this is not actually or completely true, right? There's indeed a huge difference depending on the policy that is behind. And the reason why this happens is because, you know, we are humans, we are sometimes lazy, we have no time, or we usually procrastinate, and we usually leave decisions for later. But so this example that I show you serves to explain what we mean by choice architecture. Choice architecture is the design of the different ways in which the possible options can be presented to either consumers, citizens, to the population in general, and the impact that such presentation or such organization has on the final decision of the consumer. So, for example, people are heavily influenced by the number of options that we present, the way in which these options are described, the order in which the options are presented, and obviously, as we saw, the presence of a default option, right? An option that has already been selected for you. And all of this influences people's decisions. So the most important message I would like you to take today is that behind a policy, a program, a project, there's always a series of decisions to be made. And the idea here is to try to nudge consumers, and I'll explain in a bit what that means, toward behaviors that are desirable, not only for them, but also for society, such as, for instance, savings for retirement, eating healthy, or registering as an organ donor. So the picture that you're seeing shows the typical shelf of a supermarket, and here you'll see that the supermarket owner has decided to place the milk at the eye level, which is the place where people consume the most, because it's the easiest, it's where you see. Just above that, you see water, and just for those that really want to take a different decision, you see at the bottom the sugary drinks, right? So this is an example of a nudge, because someone that may not have a clear preferences of what they want to buy, maybe just by seeing milk or water at the eye level, they would just take that. Or for example, and maybe our male colleagues today can better understand this, but it seems that sometimes our male colleagues need help to help them, right, direct their pee where they have to, right? And I believe these soccer goal nets were added to the urinals during the World Cup in Brazil, and this helped a lot keep the bathrooms clean. So this is another example of a nudge. People can do whatever they want, but these help people keep the bathrooms and more the male bathrooms clean. Great. So let me summarize here. So a nudge is not a law, but instead it's a slight change in the element of this choice architecture that I presented before. It changes people's behaviors in predictable ways for their own benefit and also for the benefit of the society. It has nothing to do with prohibiting other options. People are free to choose what they want. And for example, placing the fruit at the eye level counts as a nudge, but for instance, banning junk food is not a nudge. Right. So there's, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's multiple frameworks that help behavioral scientists in practice decide how to intervene in a particular situation, a particular context. We use several, but today I want to share with you the EAST framework, which was developed by the UK Behavioural Insight team, the BIT. And the framework is very simple. It's called EAST, and it stands for easy. The idea with easy is to, as much as you can, when designing programs or policies, try to reduce friction, try to reduce hassle factors, and simplify as much as possible, because we know that that works. The second one is it goes for attractive. And the idea here is to make things salient, personalized, and to frame things in a way that your audience will be attracted to it, right? That speaks to your audience. The third one is social. As Seina explained in our own framework, we take into account that we are social animals and we care about what others do. Then what we try to always do is to harness the power of social influences, and we try to use network and social recognition as much as possible in our designs, in our solutions design. And then finally, timing is an often overlooked aspect of the policymaking process. So for instance, while policymakers, they know how important making things timely is, it's rarely considered as a crucial part of policy design. And again, the important message here is that more attention needs to be paid to the various ways that policies are implemented. These are not mere details, since we know that they greatly influence how people react and how people behave. So now I'll briefly go through a case where you can see how we put all this in practice, right? So since 2018, we have been working with Compesa, which is the water and sanitation company in Recife, in Brazil. And this is a public company that serves around 1 million households in this area. The issue here is that water availability is a huge challenge in the region. They don't have enough water for the quantity of the population that they have. And in the particular case of Recife, water services are intermittent and unreliable, meaning that people don't get water every hour of the day, and they don't get water every day of the month. So there's water scarcity. And to make the situation even more challenging, Compesa experienced 57% of water losses. And this means water that is supplied into the network, but does not generate any revenue. So it's a huge amount of water losses. Some of this is due to physical losses. So for instance, holes in the pipes and things that require structural solutions. But half of it is explained by customer behaviors. And what do I mean with this? First, there are illegal users that connect to the pipes without contributing without paying to the company, to Compesa. And then there's defaulters, which pay, but they pay super late, and the company needs to mobilize resources to actually get the payments. And what we learned, we decided to focus on the default behavior. And what we knew at the moment is that nearly half of the clients default regularly on their water bill payments. Okay, so once we knew that we were going to focus, and we decided that we were going to focus on the defaulter behavior, we conducted diagnostic work to better understand why was that happening. So we knew that, for instance, clients in that area, they would pay on time their electricity bills, but they were not paying their water bill. So we went and spoke with the population to better understand the whys behind. So we learned three things. The first one is that people reciprocate to the poor services that they receive. As I mentioned at the beginning, they don't get water every day, and they don't get water every hour of the day. So some of them, they pay late to justify this negative reciprocity, or to justify the bad services that they receive. And this is what we call a negative reciprocity. The second thing that we learn is that people don't really perceive the consequences of behaving badly. And this is reinforced by the fact that Compesa does not always put in place the enforcement mechanisms against consumers that are defaulting. And this was named the unperceived threat of punishment. So they basically don't think about the consequences because they won't, probably they won't materialize. And then finally, it seems that most people in this area incorrectly believe that non-compliant behavior is what the majority does, right? And let me stop briefly here and explain what a descriptive norm is versus a social norm. So descriptive norms are defined as what one believes others are doing, right? This is exactly what we found in Recife. Well, social norms, which is a term that you may be familiar with, refers to what one believes others think one should do, right? But we did not find evidence of that. And this might sound as a nuance to you, but it's very important to have a good diagnostic because that influences how you think about the different solutions. Okay, so with this, we decided to design a behaviorally informed RCT SMS pilot experiment. And RCT stands for Randomized Controlled Trials, which basically mean that the groups have been assigned randomly to guarantee that there's comparability between them. We designed 5 different SMS messages and a control group. And messages were sent to a subsample of the population. So here I'll show you the messages. The first one was the Compesa message, traditional message that was being sent already to the clients. And as you can see, you know, it was personalized, so people were called by their names, but then it was pure information, right? Like nothing, nothing informed by behavioral science. So on top of that, we added a reciprocity message. So one treatment arm was this one, which basically tried to compensate for that negative reciprocity by telling consumers that, you know, the company was working hard to bring water to their families. We also had a deterrence message. We designed, we framed the message in this way, basically making the consequences of not paying salient, so that people knew that if they didn't pay, their names would be sent to the credit bureau with the consequences of not being able to apply for credit. And then finally, we tapped into the descriptive norms. So basically trying to correct these wrong beliefs that the majority of people was not paying, because in the truth was that the majority were paying. Then we added a seasonal message that was introduced by our Compesa colleagues that basically changed every month. And then one group that had no SMS, right? So nothing here. So I'll ask Johanna if you can open up the poll, if it's working. And I want to ask you which of these messages you think had a stronger impact in terms of on-time payment rates. I'll leave 10 more seconds. So if you can vote, that would be great. I see a lot of responses by now. Okay.
Because this is not an entirely easy question.
Fantastic. So again, let me read the question. Which of the following behaviorally informed messages do you think led to the highest increase in bill payment? Okay, 5 more seconds if that's okay, Johanna.
Sure.
I'll stop it.
So take your pick if you haven't voted yet. We're closing it. Now,
okay.
Here are your results.
Fantastic. So as you can see in the results, the majority of you have chosen the descriptive norm. We also see some responses in the deterrence, the reciprocity, and the seasonal message. That's great. So now I'll show you what happened in this context, in reality. Okay, fantastic. So in this graph, I'm going to show you the results that are compared with the pure control. At baseline of our subsample, 36 of the households of the control group paid their bills on time. When we look at the second bar, which is the message that Compesa was already sending, we see that it increased on-time payment rates. So what they were doing worked. However, the effect is not significant. So we cannot really tell, statistically speaking, that there's a difference with the control group. However, we were really happy to see that all behaviorally informed SMS increased on-time payment rates compared to the pure control. So as you can see, the deterrence and the reciprocity SMS had a larger impact, but all of them had positive and significant impact. So some of you detected descriptive norm, that was completely right, but in our case, the reciprocity SMS was the one that had more impacts. And the stars that you see there represent the significance level. So results may have seemed small, right? We're talking about 1 percentage point increase, but when you aggregate this to the 1 million households that live in Recife, well, that is actually a large impact for the cost that this experiment had. And right now we're in conversations with the public company, with Compesa, to scale up this SMS experiment and also to experiment with further insights. And now I'm going to pass the word back to Seina, and she will briefly explain, she will briefly explain about more complicated interventions that go beyond nudges. Over to you, Seina. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jimena. So you heard a good example of how to leverage the EAST framework to do a behavioral, to do nudges and interventions. But the behavioral work is much more bigger than this. And there's a recent paper by Sanchayan Banerjee and Peter John on Nudge Plus. And there's a lot of work right now on things such as Boost, Think, Nudge Plus. So these are new terminology that are coming out to define interventions that go beyond nudging, that actually incorporates reflection and thinking and skilling. And one example of how we're doing that, we're doing a lot of that with socio-emotional skills at the bank. And one example, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the growth mindset work by Carol Dweck, but for example, what Carol Dweck says is people with a fixed mindset believe that they are born with certain ability and cannot change them. So they approach learning from that belief. And people with a growth mindset believe that your abilities can grow through efforts and hard work. And the theory is if you inculcate a growth mindset and you improve learning attitudes towards learning, you can increase performance and perseverance, you get to improved academic labor and other outcomes. And we've conducted this intervention. We started off in Peru with the Ministry of Education and other partners, and we've rolled it out in South Africa, Indonesia, and we are seeing results where you have up to 10% increase in 2017 in final math tests. Even a year later, you still have an effect. We're seeing increase in growth mindset. And also what's amazing is that it's costing less than $1 to increase student test scores by 1 point. And in Peru, the effects are comparable to 4 months of catching up in math. So this intervention now has been scaled up a number of countries in Cyprus, Indonesia, Mexico, North Macedonia. The list is long, and it's even being shown. Some of the growth mindset work, for example, was shown on TV in Peru on national TV. So next slide. So now not only is, like, for example, the socio-emotional skills is beneficial for education, it's also very beneficial for jobs. And we are doing a number of interventions in Turkey, Ethiopia, South Africa, Lesotho, and others where we are incorporating socio-emotional skills such as aspiration and different grit, different persistence, different modules into the standard training for job search or skilling. And it's not just there. So the socio-emotional, it's not just about socio-emotional skills. There's also a lot of behavioral work that incorporates cognitive behavioral therapy, for example. And also we're seeing a lot of work right now on social cohesion, on perspective taking. These are not new concepts. A lot of these are well known in the psychology fields and others. What is new is incorporating them systematically through the behavior lens in policy and programs. So there's a lot more information. There's a lot more we can go on this. We have a lot of resources on our website, and you can learn also. We have a couple of publications where you can learn, or what are some governments, how they've set up their nudge teams, but also 17 different organizations in the UN and others that have also established nudge teams. So thank you very much for listening, and back to you, Mary.
Great, thank you so much for that, Zaina and Yamina. That was very comprehensive in a short period of time. So we have a few questions coming in. I noticed you've answered a few in the chat, or one in the chat. Anastasia, would you like to come in with your comment about diagnostic tools and surveys? Would you like to speak? I can allow you to talk if you'd like to ask the question yourself. Or not to, that's fine as well. Okay. I can read your question if you prefer. So could you please explain a bit more, Zaina and Yamina, the diagnostic tools and surveys and questionnaires, just methods that you use generally?
Sure. So Yamina, Yamina, why don't you answer this? You're working on
okay, let me step in. Great. So we basically cover like two different terrains. Like we usually start with quantitative tools and more if this data is available. So we tap into administrative data sources, household surveys, etc. If that data is available, we start exploring there. If it's not available, or if we want to know more on that kind of terrain, we also conduct surveys. Surveys can be representative, or we also run a lot of online surveys through Facebook, through mTurk, etc. This all depends on the timing, on the budget, and different criteria for each project. That's one block. And then the other, I would say, it's tapping into the qualitative tools for data collection. And this helps a lot to learn more about the nuances behind behaviors. And we normally use interviews, focus group discussions, observations, and several other, I could spend a whole session talking about that, but several other qualitative methods to understand better the context and to understand better what the factors that are driving different behaviors.
Great, thanks for that, Yamina. I think that's very helpful, and it's definitely something we've heard echoed across the UN system in terms of work across a number of entities. So we have a few questions in the Q&A box regarding ethics and how you deal with ethical issues of RCTs, and in particular, the ethics of an intervention for preventing manipulation overall. So comments there would be appreciated.
So this is an excellent question, and something that when I first started working in behavioral science as well was very much concerned about. But it's interesting that so for RCTs we follow the standard ethical processes. We discuss it with the government. We discuss it with some of our RCTs go through ethical reviews as well. It really depends on what type of RCT we are doing. I felt like really when I first started with this field, I really thought the whole fear of manipulation and it really came up, and the ethics, and I took a course on that at LSE, which really scared me even more. But at the end of the day, a lot of the work we're doing, we're just tweaking existing systems, we're improving certain things. There are big discussions, for example, and Jimena can talk a little bit about some of the ethical discussions around the messages. Do you use fear-based messages? Do you threaten of cutting services? What are some of the reactions? So these are the open discussions we have with the teams, and a lot of times actually this is something that not just we are not only comfortable with, the clients also are not comfortable with. And the rule of thumb for us is whenever we're deciding on RCT, is if you see an article on the New York Times saying that the World Bank has conducted this experiment, would you continue to do it or not? And if the question is not, then you should never do this intervention. So again, we do follow, some of our interventions do go through ethical reviews. we have a lot of internal discussions internally. We do internal reviews of our own design within the team. We have discussions, but I was kind of, I guess I should knock on wood that this hasn't really come up. We haven't felt that we've done an intervention where it bordered on the line of, you know, violating any, you know, ethical rules. Because I think everybody's just very conscious of making sure, you know, what we are doing is considered, you know, benign, safe, and we are trying to make things easier and more accessible to beneficiaries. We're always thinking of what is the best for the beneficiaries, and making also sure that they are preserving choice, that it's not something they feel that they are being basically coerced into a certain action, or making it difficult for them to do another choice. But I'll Jimena, if you want to give an example of the messaging.
Sure. So let me add two things. The first one is not only for the solution, like the part of experimenting on the RCTs, but also when we plan data collection, so more on the diagnostic side, we go through these ethical reviews, and this varies by country. So we usually tap into what the local rules are regarding that, and sometimes, you know, it's how you frame a question can have an impact also on how people feel. So it's very important to keep that in mind when you are having discussions with the population. So that on one side. The other thing I want to comment is, for instance, in the experiment of Brazil, we had an option where people could opt out of the experiment if they didn't want to receive messages, if were not feeling comfortable, they would just reply, and they were automatically removed from the experiment. So I believe that should always be an option. To allow people to decide if they want to continue or not.
Thank you. That's very helpful to give some context there. I think Zaina and I've worked previously in governments and Government of Canada. In the Privy Council office, we used to have the Globe and Mail test or the Toronto Star test as well for things that we did to make sure that it's ethical. But there are lots of ways to judge this. Leonard, this was your question. Would you like to speak and come in and provide further clarification, or you can talk if you would like? No problem as well if you don't want to either. Okay, that's fine too. Okay, so we have some more questions coming in. We have one from Alias. Would you like to ask it yourself? It's about a quick and easy list of interventions you can pitch to government. I can unmute you if you'd like to ask the question yourself. Do you have a list of quick and easy interventions we can pitch to the government? Okay, I can continue on, that's fine. Like opt out for organ donations or stuff on water, electricity. So just sort of perhaps some like best practice examples that would be useful in discussions with governments. What would you recommend?
When I started really looking at the BIT website and the IDs 42 website were the best resources. They are very good at packaging their solution interventions and putting them out there. You know, really like there's a lot on you know, increasing bill payment or tax payment. So there's a really great resources there, and we have on our website, you can see we put together like a kind of a toolkit or a policy note on what we've done on tax payment. So really I would look into these sites. Through our two publications, we have the one on behavioral science around the world, highlighting the 10 countries, and then the other one highlighting the 17 organizations, international organizations. You also see very good examples of interventions. And also, I know the UN also just published a recent publication, for example, on COVID. So there are really great resources out there. I can't think of anything else top of mind. Jimena?
No, Say, I think you covered it. I just want to say that, you know, we know that context is super important for designing solutions. So I think, I guess a word of caution when you're trying to bring, you know, things that work in one setting to another. I think at least the basic, you know, diagnostics should be done to really guarantee that you're tapping into the right behaviors and the right barriers behind those behaviors before going fully with one intervention, right? So I think it's a hard question. It's hard to say, you know, things that you can bring as solutions that could work in every topic in every country. I think we wish we had that, right? But we don't.
Exactly. Yeah. There's lots of behavioral science projects out there, but you can't always scale them as and apply them in different contexts as easy. Okay, so next we have a question from Hamilton. I can unmute you if you'd like to ask it yourself. If not, that's fine as well. I can also ask it. Oh, go ahead, please.
I wonder, what are the habituation effects of such interventions, especially in the case of Brazilian, the water company bill? What if people get used to that message? And in some, what are the effects of the medium and long-term effects of those interventions? Thank you.
So on habituation effects, that's an excellent question. Thanks, Hamilton. So I guess the clear way you can look into that is through the message that Compesa was already sending to their clients, because that message didn't vary month by month. And as you saw in the results, although it increased on-time payment rates, there was no significant effect compared to the pure control, meaning that there is for sure an habituation effect, and probably clients don't even open up the message because they know what's coming, right? We did our experiment. We conducted it through 3 different months, and the only one that changed was the seasonal SMS. We thought that changing the message month by month was going to have a higher impact at the beginning. That was our hypothesis, and it didn't turn out that way. So it broke a little bit our assumptions, and we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, we really don't. We didn't pilot for more than 3 months, so I can only speak to that. And in 3 months, there was no habituation effect whatsoever on the other messages. Regarding medium to long-term effects, we're at this precise moment looking into that, and we'll have an answer regarding 6 months and 1 year effect after the intervention, and we'll probably publish the results, either if there's an effect or not. So we'll come back on that.
Great. Okay. Thanks so much for your questions and for your responses, Anna and Jimena. It's been an interesting, fast, rapid look at what behavioral science is and some of the value it can bring to our work. So with that, I think we're going to close this first section of the webinar today. Zaina and Jimena, please feel free to stay on and engage with us as we go forward, but we can thank you as well. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing the insights that you've had. So at this time, I'd like to invite the other panelists to join us. We're going to now be moving to the launch of the UN Behavioural Science Report, which for those of you who haven't viewed it just yet, perhaps Johanna can share in the chat. It is a collection of experiences across over 25 UN entities with respect to behavioral science application, some of the projects, the impact, as well as some enablers that we've identified with respect to more systematically applying behavioral science across the UN. So I will touch upon some of those enablers as we go through our discussion, but I'm just going to introduce our panel now. So we're fortunate today to have with us Claire Hobden from the ILO, where she's a technical officer on vulnerable workers, as well as Alan Annie, head of experimentation Accelerator Lab Ghana at UNDP, and Danish Masood, who's from the Innovation Cell in UNDPPA. And they will be speaking to some of the work that they've carried out, which is featured in the UN Behavioural Science Report among those 25 entities you've submitted. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and invite Claire to come forward first to speak about her work at the ILO with respect to behavioral science. Claire, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Mary, and everybody for the opportunity to present today. I am going to share my screen. Now we are discussing here an intervention that we conducted in Argentina. This was with the purpose of increasing social security registration among domestic workers, which was a priority for the government at the time and remains so, and is also very closely linked to the indicator 831 of the SDGs. So the first thing that we had to do in order to increase the registration of domestic workers to social security was to do a diagnostic. So to do this, we carried out focus group discussions as well as other approaches to identify the barriers and the perceptions of the employers, the households employing domestic workers and domestic workers. And to do this diagnosis, we found that basically there was a gap between the way employers' households saw themselves, so their self-concept, and their behavior. So in terms of the self-concept, they felt that, you know, they had this narrative, I'm a good employer, at least better than average. Most of the time it was because they didn't scream at the domestic worker or they were, you know, complying with the minimum wage. But when it came to Social Security registration, they resolved the gap between their self-concept and the behavior by saying that it was the domestic worker who didn't want to be registered to Social Security. They didn't really know the reasons why. They just said, no, we don't do that because the domestic worker doesn't want it. So this gap between the self-concept and the behavior can produce a feeling of cognitive dissonance, meaning that they were uncomfortable with the fact that their behavior didn't match their self-concept, which is why they felt the need to find an excuse, and they did what most people do, which is to blame somebody else for it. So basically they had this narrative, I am a good employer, even though I don't register the domestic worker to Social Security, because she doesn't want to. We also found that they generally lacked information on the process of how to register the domestic workers, and they didn't know very much either about the benefits. So we conducted an experiment similar to the one that we heard about before, where we sent letters to households in Buenos Aires. It was conducted as a randomized controlled trial. And the letter that we wrote was behaviorally informed. So what we did was to try to point to the gap between the self-concept of employers and their behavior to kind of provoke that feeling of cognitive dissonance. But then instead of allowing them to excuse themselves by blaming the domestic worker, we reminded them, first of all, of their obligations, their legal obligations to register the worker, and also provided them with the tools that they needed to actually do the registration, and highlighted some of the benefits also that they would get from it. So we sent this letter out to 100,000 households, roughly. You see the figures here. And we compared it against a control group that did not receive a letter at all. So the results found that for every 1,000 letters that were sent, there was an average of 2.3 more employers that registered their domestic workers to Social Security compared to the control group. And this was a statistically significant finding. And this represents an increase of 8.9% in the rate of registration. There are all sorts of different angles to the study that we actually did. And so this was the smallest effect size that we found. There were some larger ones if you look at subgroups within the sample that we collected. So that's our intervention.
Great, thanks a lot, Claire. That's really helpful and succinct in terms of describing what behavioral science is, as well as you've actually done through the RCT. I have just a question regarding the process and how you carried it out. So what are some of the challenges in terms of staff and institutional capacity to implement this that you faced in the work that you did?
Well, that is a really good question, because we don't really have staff at the ILO who are trained in behavioral science, with the exception of myself. So we worked on designing the intervention together with staff that had experience doing impact evaluations, which was incredibly helpful because it's one of the hardest aspects in a way of carrying out these field experiments. And we also relied quite heavily on the investment and engagement of the Ministry of Labor in particular, which includes within it a research department that had the capacity to carry out the field experiment and also to carry out the impact evaluation, which also helped resolve some of the issues that you can encounter sometimes around access to data. So for example, the government might not have wanted to share with us the administrative data that they were using to conduct the impact evaluation, but they were able to do it themselves instead.
Great, that's really helpful to understand a bit more of how you're able to actually execute this. I just wanted to leave some space here. If there are any questions or clarifying comments from the group, feel free to raise your hand, or you can also come in at the end with more general comments and questions. Okay, if not now, then that's fine. We'll come in at the end with more questions. Thanks so much, Claire. excuse me, I'd like to now invite Alan from UNDP to describe a bit of his work that he submitted to the UN Behavioural Science Report and applying behavioural science in Ghana. Alan, over to you.
Hi, just a second. Okay. Right. There we go. So, hello everyone. So I'm sharing a BI sort of pilot experiment done by the UNDP Accelerator Lab in Ghana on segregation and recycling of plastics. So briefly, the context is plastics pollution in Ghana linked to recent significant economic growth, at least leading up to COVID, which meant increased consumption of plastic products and generation of plastic waste and its leakage into the environment. Indeed, only 5% of those plastics are recycled, so huge potential for a circular economy, if you like, in plastics. In 2019, the Accelerator Lab attended some training in Tunis on BI, organized by the UN, and we began looking at applying these tools to waste management. So we began work to leverage the collective intelligence, if you like, of communities, recycling startups, and the large number of informal sector waste pickers in the country to kind of really put together a program of work. Recycling is one of Ghana's policy responses to the plastics crisis, but this clearly requires commitment of households and businesses to segregate their plastics, which means behavioral change. So along with partners, we decided to focus on conducting experiments based on particular recycling bins located at selected fuel stations. And that's what you can see. Well, I just clicked and it says network of bins, where communities can deposit their plastics. And these are very interesting behavioral hotspots, if you think about it, where a primary activity, which is buying fuel for your car, can be reframed to include buying snacks at an on-site shop, getting your car serviced, and also depositing plastic bottles in a bin. We noticed a marked decline in use of the bins, and we decided to test to see if BI could help increase rates of plastic segregation by households and businesses, lead to more plastics being deposited in the bins. But clearly, as you've heard from the very excellent description we had from colleagues at the World Bank, this would require shifting social norms from seeing this only as a government responsibility towards recognizing individual responsibility to actually take part in segregation of plastics and using the bins. So one of the outcomes of our collective intelligence exercise was a set of archetypes which describe different approaches to segregation, ranging from those who don't segregate or who are simply not interested, and we call them the no chance OMAs, to those who do so intermittently, we call them the just passing AMA, i.e. just passing a station and might decide to, and maybe Mansas, who may decide to do so every so often. And then the prolific segregators, who are the eco-conscious Kofi and AMA. I think the power of the approach was the ability to segment the community and link attitudes to behavior in interesting ways. We also use Ghanaian names. So for example, we were using Ama, which is a Saturday-born female. So introducing an element of fun and humor, if you like, in what can be a rather dry topic for most of the population in Ghana. So we turned two of the archetypes, that is the eco-conscious Kofi. Kofi is a Friday-born male, and eco-conscious Ama, into billboards. And you can see on the screen an example of one of the billboards, which were placed at the fuel stations in order to drive this shift in social norms. But in addition to the character, we then included BI concepts to make them more relatable and easier to remember. So one key thing was we personalized the messages to local communities. So if you look on your screen, there's a red speech bubble, which says, Osuman B, don't just throw your plastics away. And Osuman B is the Ga language, one of the languages in Ghana. but it's basically an exhortation to the people of Wusu to pay attention, a call to action, not to throw their plastics away. In addition, you notice that at the bottom of the screen, there's a bit of text, which I'll read out, which says, fire at the fufuro. Again, we used another local language, in this case, chi, and this phrase really means use something which exists for something new. So along the lines of don't throw things away and so on. And finally, we tried to trigger some cognitive dissonance as well by using particular imagery in the billboards to make people feel uncomfortable if they weren't paying attention to these issues. So thankfully, these experiments have been very successful. We set ourselves a target of 10% increase in plastics. We've actually achieved 18% and 44% at 2 sites. And these sort of increases were not apparent at the 2 control locations, which actually continue to show declines. So we're looking to take this forward by maybe working with communities, looking at rolling out an animation to schools and so on, based on these characters. So in summary, this has been one recent experience at the UNDP Ghana country office, and thanks for listening. Over.
Great, thank you so much for that, Alan. It sounds like you've done quite a bit of work to apply behavioral science in a meaningful way when it comes to recycling. So what are your plans? Are there plans to expand this work going forward, or what are you thinking at this point in time?
I think very much the work of the Accelerator Labs is rooted in grassroots solutions and getting communities to do things for themselves rather than always telling them what to do. So what we're thinking, we've developed an animation actually based on these characters. And the hope is to roll that out in a program in schools and in communities. The idea being the feedback we got from communities is it's very important to inculcate these concepts when people are young, rather than waiting till someone is 40 or 50 to try to change their approach to managing plastic. So that's one element. The other element is working with the Ghana Plastic Action Partnership. That is a group of, it involves government and other stakeholders to really look at this issue of behavior in tackling the plastics crisis alongside the core issues of enforcement and policy and so on. So we're taking it forward in different ways. Thanks.
That's really great to hear that you're expanding upon that on the work that you've done already. So we have a few questions in the chat here regarding some of the archetypes you've put together. So AMA was used twice in the archetypes. Did this impact the message recall at all, or did you find anything there with respect to using AMA twice? And a related question also is what's the reason for using names, as some have negative message and some have positive ones? Is there a reason why you chose names associated with positive or negative messages? And do you think that had an impact on people with those who have those real names? Just more about the names would be helpful overall. Thanks.
Okay, excellent. The brilliant first question, well, both questions are brilliant, but the first question particularly brilliant because it's some way through that the sort of the double AMA came up. I think the difference is it's the just passing. So AMA can be just passing and AMA can be eco-conscious as well. So this was just to sort of introduce a twist, if you like, in that not all AMAs are just passing. So just passing means they do so intermittently, and eco-conscious, sounds really good. They do it regularly. So we just didn't want to sort of create an issue for the AMAs. So it was a kind of introducing a sense of humor, if you like, into the archetypes. And this was actually suggested by some of the informal sector waste pickers who helped us design the archetypes, who said, wouldn't it be a good twist if we had 2 types of AMAs in the same set of archetypes? What was the second question again? Sorry. Oh, the use of names.
Yes.
In Ghana, everyone, well, we have day names. So for example, I'm born on Tuesday, so my name is Kwabena, and everyone born on Tuesday has a name covenant. Whether you choose it or not is another issue. Kofi, as in Kofi Annan, is a Friday, Amma is a Saturday, and so on. So it's something people can relate to, particularly for the Akan tribes in Ghana, but all the other tribes as well understand that Kofi, Amma, Abena, and so on carry a particular significance. So it was a way of uniting people around a name they understood. And again, introducing a sense of humor and fun into what can often be a quite a stiff topic.
Thanks for the clarification. That's quite helpful. So just to follow up a little bit on that question, it was about sort of the negative associations with certain days. So there's fun associated with that as well. It wasn't kind of sort of all a certain name is a negative association. It was sort of done in a way that was a bit playful. Is that kind of what you were getting at as well?
Yes, it was done in a way that is playful and that is relatable. So for most Ghanaians in that community, if you said Amma or Abena or Kofi, it meant something to them. But there's no negative association with the simple name at all. Yeah.
Great, thanks for that. Okay, thank you, Alan. We'll come back shortly to hear more from you on the panel. Next, I'd like to call upon Danish Masood to speak to some of the work of DPPA with respect to behavioral science. Danish, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much for organizing this, and thank you for your time. As you'll see in the report that was shared earlier in the chat, our work in this area is at a very preliminary stage, and perhaps you'll see, at least in the conversation that we will have together, that it's a little bit focused on how to apply behavioral science within the context of a conservative bureaucracy. So I work for DPPA, the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, which is part of the UN Peace and Security pillar. And as many of you know, that is generally one of the more conservative parts of the UN. Furthermore, within DPPA, we focus on peace building and peacemaking. Peace building you can think of as peace-related initiatives or initiatives oriented around enhancing the possibility of peace between communities, and peacemaking you can perhaps think of more as this type of high-level dialogue, negotiation, mediation processes that our department and its special political missions through mandates from the UN Security Council embark on in order to build peace in conflict zones, right? So for instance, if we're mediating between the conflict parties between the East and West in Libya, or between the Houthis or Ansarullah and the government of Yemen in the Yemen war, that's the kind of work we do. Now, why do I say all this? I say all this because it's not so straightforward necessarily to do what we're trying to do, which is to generate support for and an understanding of the practical value of behavioral science-informed approaches to peace and security work in DPPA, right? And I say all this also with a view to having these types of that support leading to actual projects. So in our case, when we say behavioral science, what we mean is really the trifecta, right? Of problem-driven design, the use of scientific approaches and evidence based on scientific approaches and studies in what we do, and rigorous testing. That's what we mean when we say behavioral science. However, in reality, practically speaking, frankly, the way we've operated up to now, at least at this initial preliminary stage where we're trying to generate support inside the bureaucracy for a behavioral science-informed approach, we've also included applied neuroscience, we've included social behavioral change communication, all fields that are linked, that are ancillary. Of course, behavioral science itself is a very interdisciplinary field, as many of you know already. But some of the interventions we're talking about, some of the studies we're looking at are not purely behavioral science. So what have we done so far? What we've done is focus primarily on understanding the field and understanding what our options are and trying to educate our colleagues about those things. When I say, I should also add here that because we're drawing on applied neuroscience in particular, a lot of the kinds of interventions or treatments are slightly different from what is most conservatively behavioral science, right? So things like debiasing, norm nudging, which you can think of as partially linked, perspective taking and shifting narratives, paradoxical thinking, dehumanization, and meta misperceptions, those types of things, right? And just to help people understand what I mean when I say those things, just a very quick set of definitions as to what I mean. When I talk about debiasing, I'm talking about focusing on dissolving cognitive biases and periconceptual behavior that are underlying drivers of intergroup hostility and conflict contexts. When it comes to norm nudging, what I mean is powerful interventions that are aimed at altering conditional assumptions and belief systems, right? By subtly and cautiously affecting and influencing people's behaviors. When I talk about shifting narratives, sometimes you have these entrenched intergroup narratives around that have to do with intergroup hostility. How do we engage in perspective taking, where we listen to what the other side has to say and understand what the other side, or where the other side is coming from, or the traumas that inform the other side's view, and vice versa, and how does that shift things? When I talk about paradoxical thinking, this one is a little bit interesting. I should add here as a side note that everything that we're talking about here in terms of interventions or treatments that are a combination of behavioral science, applied neuroscience, and social and behavioral change communication draw on scientific evidence and studies, right? So onto paradoxical thinking again. When we say that, we're drawing on studies done in the context of Israel-Palestine, where we learned that in fact, when you have high levels of intergroup hostility, telling a particular conflict party why they are wrong is not effective. Strangely enough, taking their point of view to an absurd extent is more effective than telling them why they're wrong. When we talk about dehumanization, again, this is all that that I think in a conventional way will be familiar to you. This is your classic example. You can talk about World War II. You can talk about what happened with various groups during World War II. You can talk about Rwanda. You can talk about Bosnia. But basically, the idea that that you can deny humanity to a particular group. Now, of course, this is not new, but one of the things we're looking at here is what we call meta misperceptions. And this is interesting because what we see as a potential intervention or something interesting here is that within an intergroup dynamic that's polarized, where you have an in-group and an out-group, conflict parties, communities that are in conflict, one community will tend to have ideas about how the other community perceives it, right? So let's say I have a conflict with my colleague, Martin, right? And my meta perception of in this instance would be what I believe, what the kinds of beliefs that I believe Martin has about me, right? And so those kinds of meta perceptions are hugely important in addressing intergroup hostility, according to the data and studies that we have reviewed. In particular, in the case of Colombia, a social behavioral change communication-based intervention, i.e. a film that was shown to address hostility between former FARC fighters and the broader Colombian public, addressed misperceptions that the Colombian public had about FARC fighters. And this changed attitudes over a longer period than other interventions. We can share the study with you if that's interesting. I'm speaking in broad terms. But I say all this because, again, to demonstrate the stage we're at, where we've been engaging in a broad consultation with behavioral scientists, with neuroscientists. We've been engaged in a broad literature. So where are we arrived at so far? We've been able to, within DPPA, incorporate behavioral science into our strategic plan. We did so before the issuance of the SG report and the guidance, which is important for us. The fact that we were able to act and put that into the strategic plan. That was not straightforward. We've conducted multiple sessions explaining to our colleagues, running trainings, trying to get people to understand. We've also worked very closely with the heads of missions. So as you know, DPPA often works on the basis of mandates from the Security Council. As I said earlier, under those mandates, we establish on-the-ground presences that we call special political missions. So we've talked to special political missions and basically tried to explain and understand their points of view. We've encountered all kinds of skepticism. I'll get into that later. But basically, we've had to be evangelists for brain and behavioral science across DPPA. Where we've arrived at currently is now we're working on 3 pilot projects, and this was the last thing I'll say, in collaboration with country teams and special political missions. I'll tell you very quickly what those 3 pilot projects are. In Iraq, we're looking to increase the participation of young people in the electoral process, given that there's a high level of apathy among young people, and many of them are very unlikely to vote in elections that are coming up in October. Here, just to give you an example and to go into the granularity a little bit, we're drawing on research by Todd Rogers, who's done a lot of work around the kinds of microinterventions that are effective in increasing voter turnout, having to do with making commitments, bridging the intention-action gap, having to do with peer accountability, and also tokenization and incentives, i.e., for instance, if I get a soccer ball for voting, that might be enough of a driver of that behavior. In the context of the Caucasus, particularly that's one project. The Iraq project is one project. Secondly, in the context of the Caucasus.
Sorry, can I just come in for a second? Maybe we can talk about the other 2 as we go on to the panel discussion, just because we want to kind of keep going. But thank you. This has been really interesting and amazing to see so much work being done at DPPA. We know that every entity is on their own journey and different approaches and different ways in which they're embedding behavioral science into the organization. But really great to see the strategic plan and the pilots already ongoing. So thank you for that. I see there's a question in the chat regarding RCTs, so kind of circling back to some of the discussion we had previously with respect to Claire and Alan, as well as UNIN and Zaina, before we go into the more general discussion. Austin, would you like to ask your question to the panel? If not, I can also try to paraphrase it. It's quite a long one. No? Okay. So what mechanism do you use to implement an RCT or a nudge? So this is for Claire or any of the panelists. What mechanism do you use to sort of decide to implement an RCT or a nudge? Sort of thinking around there would be helpful. Thanks, Claire.
Sure. I think that when at all possible, doing an RCT is definitely desirable. Whether it's in the lab or the field is a different question. That's already one thing. I feel like it is a very challenging endeavor. There's no question about it. And making sure that you have the right skill set among the team carrying it out is really essential as well. And specifically in order to carry out a lot of the different aspects that are embedded in the question here. And I think, so there's having the staff capacity to be able to carry it out, to really understand how to do that, which I think is important because I think behavioral science is at a stage of its development right now where we have the tools to do rigorous experimentation. We do have the methods to, start with lab experiments to really get a lot of internal validity to the results before moving out into the field to get that external validity, make sure that it's working in the real world. In an ideal scenario, you would really have both, where you're sort of building up the knowledge base so that once you get into the field experiment, you're limiting the possible sources of error. And so I think part of the question is, how we measure change. So I think at least for for us, yes, we measured percentage change, let's say, or the difference between the control and the treatment group, but we also collect data on, you know, the baseline and monitor the evolution in registration to Social Security in this case, over 6 months, 8 months, 9 months. So I didn't present all the results here, but that's definitely one of the important aspects, I think, also to capture whether the changes are sustainable. So we noticed, for example, that the letter had an impact over the first 3-4 months, and then afterwards that impact started reducing. But we were able to do that also because it was the government's own team, in a way, that was monitoring the evolution.
Great, thanks for that, Claire. Would anybody else like to comment on this question, or we can go to a more of a panel discussion as well? Okay, thanks.
I can quickly just come in.
Come in now. Yes, please.
I can. So basically, when I think like so a lot of the work, most of us are working actually in operations, right? We're not here just to do research. We're not like a research-based groups. We're trying to do research in the field. So, which can be very challenging. And I think when deciding to do the RCT, what kind of RCT, our goal is to keep costs as low as possible. So we look into, is there admin data available that you could leverage so you don't have to do data collection? Can we improve some of the data collection, the admin data available? You know, if we do work with them to strengthen those systems, will that have long-term impact? So I think, you know, I think what's nice about our work is it's not just we are so solely focused on this behavioral intervention, like what there's a lot of in academia. What we try to do is impact beyond that. And a lot of the work we've done, we see the impact we've done was beyond just the nudges we've done on the interventions, is actually helping the government institutes, entities to improve their admin data, because they realize how important it is. Make sure it's clean, make sure it's updated. So I just want to say that, like, you know, our impact, our work, it is beyond the RCT and the value of just the RCT. But then there is deciding whether RCT is the right way to do the experiment. A lot of times it is complicated. You may not have enough power. You may want to use different, do quasi experiments. You may end up doing, you know, a quick A/B testing because you're limited by time and funding, or it may just do a pre and post. So I think there are different approaches there. RCT would be the best way to do it, but it's not the only way, because at the end of the day, we are trying to make, you know, small changes in actual projects on the field. So you need to take that into consideration, and what's best for that intervention, for that ministry, and what's really feasible with the funds you have and the resources you have. So just wanted to basically add, it's not as simple as, you know, when you're trying to do research in academia.
Very good point, Zena. And I think COVID-19 has definitely thrown behavioral science a curveball in terms of some of the methods, RCTs, and the timelines that we had to deal with have changed. So there's been a lot of survey work and more rapid A/B testing, as you were alluding to as well. So, so yes, it's not, behavioral science is not just RCTs. There are other methods we use too and work in a non-academic way. Okay, great. So thank you for the questions. I would just like to now shift our discussion a bit more to thinking about how do we more enable the application of behavioral science in a general sense. So going away from the specific projects to more of a general thoughts about behavioral science overall in an application organization. So coming back to the UN Behavioural Science Report, I just wanted to go through a few of those enablers I referenced earlier that were identified through discussions with 25 UN entities, as well as 12 governments and international organizations who've already worked to embed behavioral science, so kind of have already thought about how to systematically apply it in their work. So these include really creating a culture that supports behavioral science. So it's been flagged that colleagues should have a basic understanding of key concepts and the potential for impact, as well as senior leaders being able to demonstrate their support and act as champions. Secondly, strengthening behavioral science capacity. So as Claire alluded to throughout her remarks, technical behavioral science expertise is needed in the UN. This has been flagged to us previously by a number of colleagues. So this could be done through training, hiring behavioral scientists, as well as strengthening internal and external partnerships. Thirdly, a third enabler is supporting the application of behavioral science through developing strategies, guidelines for the ethical application, as well as rigorous application, and really working with entities to help identify, conceptualize, design, and implement projects. So it kind of follows the process that was outlined by the World Bank earlier in the session. And then fourth, the final enabler that was identified is with respect to fostering exchange, collaboration, across the UN and beyond. So thinking about maximizing learning, building upon existing experiences and avoiding duplication of efforts, bringing colleagues across the UN together as well as outside to progress in this space. So those are just some things that we've identified across the UN as potential enablers to further behavioral science work. But I wanted to ask the panel, in thinking more broadly about your application of behavioral science, what are some of the main lessons learned or challenges and enablers in the work that you've done that would be useful to others thinking about applying behavioral science who perhaps are at the earlier stages of their journey? So to the panel, over to you, perhaps first to Claire, if you're able to come in. You're muted, Claire. Sorry, you're muted. Yeah.
I always forget that mute button. I would say that one of the big lessons that I've learned across the board is that you can assemble a team of colleagues if you do a good sort of mapping of where the skill sets are. I think that building internal capacity to be able to carry out this kind of work is important. So, you know, in Argentina, but also in other interventions in other countries, we've been able to pull this off. Again, either with staff that have impact evaluation expertise, which is really a core component, and combining it with somebody who has behavioral science expertise. So that's definitely one combination that I think is really essential. And the second point that I should mention is that it was really important to integrate behavioral science interventions into the organizations, in this case, the ILO's model of change of doing business. This is really crucial, I think, to gain support and also to show that the flexibility of behavioral science, that it can be applied in different ways. So the ILO is a tripartite organization, meaning we represent governments, but also workers' organizations, unions, and employers' organizations. And, you know, it was a very interesting experience to present this approach to them, to get their buy-in, explain what it was. And in the end, actually going through that whole process really helped to contextualize the behavioral intervention, to build buy-in, to shape the interventions that we were actually going to take on, and then to finally, you know, make sure that the findings of the intervention and the next steps from the intervention were also going to be sustainable. So it's not just a one-off effort.
Great, thanks for that, Claire. Alan, do you have any thoughts about general enablers for the application of behavioral science?
Yes, I do, thanks. I think as Claire says, there's something about building that internal capacity. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I think increasingly there's sharing, particularly amongst the UNDP Accelerator Labs who've done some work in this area, and beyond that to sort of build that capacity. I think I'd say something about really involving people. I think there's a tendency to extract data from people, rationalize it, and do things to them. And I think there's a middle ground, some sort of sweet spot of actually as much as possible involving people in some of the solutions we come up with. That is, a grassroots communities and so on, so that they can feed back and correct some of our thinking. Because particularly when we're trying to build capacity in government, that's the bottom line. Is the public going to do anything based on this study or this pilot you've done? And involving sort of communities at the outset means you're prepared for where things go wrong. I think the other thing is there's a tendency also to see things. We've got to interrogate our own paradigms sometimes, even when we engage with communities, because you're looking for the answer you expect. And sometimes when you don't see what you expect, that anomaly, you tend to rationalize it away. But therein, in that anomaly, often is the news about how the system can be changed or developed and so on. So I think particularly with policymakers and the government, and perhaps with senior leaders within the UN, I think people do get that it's not just about regulation and enforcement and policy. There's some fuzzy thing about people sometimes don't do what you expect them to do, but some concern about it sounding so amorphous and kind of lacking in any kind of methodological rigor. And then the challenge is putting that across, I think giving examples of where behavioral science has contributed. I think a last point, and picking up on the archetypes also that we used in our study, the reality is the majority of the population in Ghana are not eco-conscious. They are no chance owners, they're not doing it, or they're doing it once in a while. And when you're explaining this to a policymaker in government or a minister, they want to hear that you understand the reality you're dealing with, and you are wrestling with that, and you acknowledge the reasons why people may not be doing those idealized behaviors we expect. And so adopting a more incremental approach to getting them to change. So sorry, it's a whole stream of consciousness thing, but I think it's a really exciting time for behavioral science, looking at it from the Ghana government end, but we've really got to grasp it before the opportunity slips away.
No, there's a lot in there, Alan. Thank you. I think we often talk about this radical incrementalism approach, so kind of getting there, but through an incremental way. And the idea of positive deviance is something I've worked with you and women about. It's just kind of finding those anomalies where things are working and studying those in more detail. Great, so thank you so much for that. And Danish, I'm sorry I cut you off earlier. Would you like to come back in again and speak to your other examples, or just more broadly about enablers for behavioral science at that within DVPA?
Sure. So the first thing is, a lot of patience. Peace and security work is complicated. It's very conservative, sclerotic. It's unlike development or humanitarian affairs in that sense. There's a lot of skepticism. The usual stuff. Isn't all our work behavioral? Things like, isn't this mind control? Sometimes having to relitigate support for BSI-informed approaches with senior managers. And so patience is what I'd counsel. The second thing I'd say is that because colleagues are so oversubscribed and stretched thin, there is a lack of capacity to implement projects. And so you have to almost come with turnkey solutions where you say, this is a problem, you have to diagnose it, this is what we'll do, this is based on scientific evidence, and this is how we'll test it. Which leads me to my next point, which is connected to what Zaina and others were saying about RCTs, is that there is a misalignment of incentives when it comes to impact versus studying things. For a lot of our colleagues in the field, particularly on the ground in conflict contexts, they don't care about the fact that we'd like to test it because of this behavioral science approach we have. They just want impact. And this goes down to nitty-gritty things like, how are you line items in a budget? So they'll say, well, we can't spend money on the testing, sorry. If you want to test things, you're welcome to, but you have to raise your own money to do it, which is what we're having to do, by the way, in one of the pilot projects that I talked about. So it's not easy. Last thing I'll say is signaling to the academic community that there is a need for more individuals working at the intersection of behavioral science and peace and security. As I shared earlier in my remarks, a lot of what we're drawing on is applied neuroscience and social psychology and not behavioral science in earnest. That's because there aren't that many people working at the intersection of behavioral science and peace and security, because it's not straightforward to do so for all the reasons I mentioned earlier. So that kind of signaling is going to be very, very important moving forward. Thanks.
Great, thank you for those points. It's really interesting about just this idea of experimentation and the value of that. I think it's something that's been echoed across entities, but particularly in your context, I can imagine it's quite challenging. And yes, academics being more engaged in the work that we do can really help to bridge that gap and to ensure that the research is meaningfully, and there are more people working in the space, and also the research actually informs some of the questions that we have in practice. Okay, so with that, I see we've reached time. I'm sure we can continue this discussion on much further, but I just want to conclude here by saying thank you very much for joining us. I'm just going to share briefly, quickly, a few slides about ways you can engage with the UN Behavioral Science group if you are keen to work with us going forward. Sorry, I got through these slides, all the presentations. So if you're keen to engage with us, a few just 4 key points here. So engage in the events of UN Behavioral Science Week. There are 3 more days to go, and the rest of today as well. So there's lots to attend. Read the UN Secretary General's Guidance Note on Behavioral Science. It was launched yesterday. It outlines a number of ways in which behavioral science can be leveraged by the UN. Also, the UN Behavioral Science Report. It's clearly launched now. I encourage you to take a closer look at that and join the group, as mentioned earlier, and also follow us on Twitter if you want to hear more about what we're doing overall. So with that, thank you very much for your time. Looking forward to seeing you in the next sessions over the coming days, and yeah, see you soon. Thanks, everyone.